the chances of it being picked up by the cameras would be good, but the chances of photographing something flying any lower would be less. This may account for the fact that while our inquiring astronomer was at the Meteorite Patrol camera sites, he talked to an astronomer who had seen a UFO while operating one of the patrol cameras. Many people have asked why our astronomers haven't seen anything through their big telescopes. They are focused light years away, and their field of vision is so narrow that even if UFOs did exist and littered the atmosphere, they wouldn't be seen. Another question the panel had was about Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds broadcast of October 1938, which caused thousands of people to panic. Had we studied this to see if there were any similarities between it and the current UFO reporting? We had. Matter and gave us an opinion. To make a complete study and get a positive answer would require an effort that would dwarf the entire UFO project. But he did have a few comments. There were many documented cases in which a series of innocent circumstances triggered by the broadcast had caused people to completely lose all sense of good judgment, to panic. There were some similar reports in our UFO files. But we had many reports in which people reported UFOs and obviously hadn't panicked. Reports from pilots who had seen mysterious lights at night and, thinking that they might be a cockpit reflection, had turned off all their cockpit lights. Or the pilots who turned and rolled their airplanes to see if they could change the angle of reflection and get rid of the UFO. Or those pilots who climbed and dove thousands of feet and then leveled out to see if the UFO would change its relative position to the airplane. Or the amateur astronomer who made an excellent sighting and before he reluctantly reported it as a UFO, had talked to a half-dozen professional astronomers and physicists in hopes of finding an explanation. All of these people were thinking clearly, questioning themselves as to what the sightings could be, then trying to answer their questions. These people weren't panicked. The question and answer period went on for a full day as the scientists dug into the details of the general facts I had given them in my briefing. The following day and a half was devoted to reviewing and discussing 50 of our best sighting reports that we had classed as unknowns. The next item on the agenda, when the panel had finished absorbing all of the details of the 50 selected top reports, was a review of a very hot and very highly controversial study. It was based on the idea that Major Dewey Fournet and I had talked about several months before, an analysis of the motions of the reported UFOs in an attempt to determine whether they were intelligently controlled. The study was hot because it wasn't official, and the reason it wasn't official was because it was so hot. It concluded that the UFOs were interplanetary spaceships. The report had circulated around high command levels of intelligence, and it had been read with a good deal of interest. But even though some officers at command levels, just a notch below General Samford, bought it, the space behind the words "approved by" was blank. No one would stick his neck out and officially send it to the top. Dewey Fournet, who had completed his tour of active duty in the Air Force and was now a civilian, was called from Houston, Texas, to tell the scientists about the study since he had worked very closely with the group that had prepared it. The study covered several hundred of our most detailed UFO reports. By a very critical process of elimination based on the motion of the reported UFOs, Fournet told the panel how he and any previous analysis by Project Blue Book had been disregarded, and how those reports that could have been caused by any one of the many dozen known objects, balloons, airplanes, astronomical bodies, etc., were sifted out. This sifting took quite a toll, and the study ended up with only 10 or 20 reports that fell into the unknown category. Since such critical methods of evaluation had been used, these few reports proved beyond a doubt that the UFOs were intelligently controlled by persons with brains equal to or far surpassing ours. The next step in the study, Fournet explained, was to find out where they came from. Earthlings were eliminated, leaving the final answer, spacemen. Both Dewey and I had been somewhat worried about how the panel would react to a study with such definite conclusions. But when he finished his presentation, it was obvious from the tone of the questioning that the men were giving the conclusions serious thought. Fournet's excellent reputation was well known. On Friday morning, we presented the feature attractions of the session, the Tremonton movie and the Montana movie. These two bits of evidence represented the best photos of UFOs that Project Blue Book had to offer. The scientists knew about them, especially the Tremonton movie, because since late July they had been the subject of many closed-door conferences. Generals, admirals, and GS-16s had seen them at command performances, and they had been flown to Kelly Air Force Base in Texas to be shown to a conference of intelligence officers from all over the world. Two of the country's best military photo laboratories, the Air Force Lab at Wright Field and the Navy's lab at Anacostia, Maryland, had spent many hours trying to prove that the UFOs were balloons, airplanes, or stray light reflections, but they failed. The UFOs were true unknowns. The possibility that the movie had been faked was considered, but quickly rejected, because only a Hollywood studio with elaborate equipment could do such a job, and the people who filmed the movies didn't have this kind of equipment. The Montana movie had been taken on August 15, 1950, by Nick Mariana, the manager of the Great Falls baseball team. It showed two large bright lights flying across the blue sky in an echelon formation. There were no clouds in the movie to give an indication of the UFO's speed, but at one time they passed behind a water tower. The lights didn't show any detail. They appeared to be large circular objects. Mariana had sent his movies to the Air Force back in 1950, but in 1950 there was no interest. Quick viewing, Project Grudge had written them off as the reflections from two F-94 jet fighters that were in the area. In 1952, at the request of the Pentagon, I reopened the investigation of the Montana movie. Working through an intelligence officer at the Great Falls Air Force Base, I had Mariana reinterrogated and obtained a copy of his movie, which I sent to the photo lab. When the photo lab got the movie, they had a little something to work with because the two UFOs had passed behind a reference point, the water tower. Their calculations quickly confirmed that the objects were not birds, balloons, or meteors. Balloons drift with the wind, and the wind was not blowing in the direction that the two UFOs were traveling. No exact speeds could be measured, but the lab could determine that the lights were traveling too fast to be birds and too slow to be meteors. This left airplanes as the only answer. The intelligence officer at Great Falls had dug through huge stacks of files and found that only two airplanes, two F-94s, were near the city during the sighting, and that they had landed about 2 minutes afterwards. Both Mariana and his secretary, who had also seen the UFOs, had said that the two jets had appeared in another part of the sky only a minute or two after the two UFOs had disappeared in the southeast. This in itself would eliminate the jets as candidates for the UFOs, but we wanted to double check. The two circular lights didn't look like F-94s. but anyone who has done any flying can tell you that an airplane so far away that it can't be seen can suddenly catch the sun's rays and make a brilliant flash. First, we studied the flight paths of the two F-94s. We knew the landing pattern that was being used on the day of the sighting, and we knew when the two F-94s landed. The two jets just weren't anywhere close to where the two UFOs had been. Next, we studied each individual light, and both appeared to be too steady to be reflections. We drew a blank on the Montana movie. It was an unknown. We also drew a blank on the Tremonton movie, a movie that had been taken by Navy Chief Photographer Warrant Officer Delbert C. Newhouse on July 2, 1952. Our report on the incident showed that Newhouse, his wife, and their two children were driving to Oakland, California from the East Coast on this eventful day. They had just passed through Tremonton, Utah, a town north of Salt Lake City, and had traveled about 7 miles on U.S. Highway 30S when Mrs. Newhouse noticed a group of objects in the sky. She pointed them out to her husband. He looked, pulled over to the side of the road, stopped the car, and jumped out to get a better look. He didn't have to look very long to realize that something highly unusual was taking place, because in his 21 years in the Navy and 2,000 hours flying time as an aerial photographer, he'd never seen anything like this. About a dozen shiny disc-like objects were milling around the sky in a rough formation. Newhouse had his movie camera, so he turned the turret around to a 3-inch telephoto lens and started to photograph the UFOs. He held the camera still and took several feet of film, getting all of the bright objects in one photo. All of the UFOs had stayed in a compact group from the time the Newhouse family had first seen them, but just before they disappeared over the western horizon, one of them left the main group and headed east. Newhouse swung his camera around and took several shots of it, holding his camera steady and letting the UFO pass through the field of view before it disappeared in the east. When I received the Tremonton films, I took them right over to the Wright Field Photo Lab, along with the Montana movie, and the photo technicians and I ran them 20 or 30 times. The two movies were similar in that in both of them the objects appeared to be large circular lights. In neither one could you see any detail. But unlike the Montana movie, the lights in the Tremonton movie would fade out, then come back in again. This fading immediately suggested airplanes reflecting light, but the roar of a king-sized dogfight could have been heard for miles, and the Newhouse family had heard no sound. We called in several fighter pilots, and they watched the UFOs circling and darting in and out of the cloudless blue sky. Their unqualified comment was that no airplane could do what the UFOs were doing. Balloons came under suspicion, but the lab eliminated them just as quickly by studying the kind of a reflection given off by a balloon. It is a steady reflection, since a balloon is spherical. Then, to further scuttle the balloon theory, clusters of balloons are tied together and don't